Hello again, Netrunner fans, Willingdon here, and I'm back to review Breaker Bay, the second data pack in the San cycle. This pack is coming right before the Regionals tournament season, and I think it should be legal for basically all of the Regionals. It could be the latest released pack for a fair number of those Regionals as well, depending on when the other packs are released and things like that. This is truly an exceptional pack, and I want to get right into it. We're going to start by looking at the runner cards, and in part 2, we'll look at the corporation cards. We're going to start things off with a new current for Anarch. This is called Hacktivist Meeting. It's 1 to play, it's 2 influence. An event current, which means that it's not trashed until another current is played or the corporation scores an agenda. As an additional cost to res non-ice cards, the corp must randomly trash a card from HQ. I'm a bit baffled that there isn't a whole lot of buzz about this card online. Generally, I think that the online communities correctly predict the cards that are going to have a pretty massive impact on the game, although I think almost always they exaggerate the power level and impact of those cards. I haven't really heard a lot about this card, and I think that this is a really solid, if narrow, option for quite a few Anarch decks. The main thing is that in the current metagame, there are a lot of non-ice cards being played that get rezzed, either in the form of asset economy, like we see with like a near pad deck playing lots of pad campaigns, or we see in like replicating perfection with like Sundew and Mental Health Clinic, as well as lots of upgrades. And we also see Jackson Howard in every deck. This is obviously pretty good against that. Just in general, the fact that they're going to have to randomly trash a card out of HQ seems like a massive deterrent to me. Seems like it's pretty hard to play around, especially with RP. And it seems like in general that's going to really make it difficult to res those drip economy cards if this is in play. So I see that this could really easily fit into some existing denial strategies. I think that it could really be strong in like Reyna or maybe Edward Kim or Wizard or something like that. A deck that's looking to deny the corporation credits and limit their ability to res ice and just play correctly. Seems like this could really work well with Siphon. If you have one of these in play, it's going to be a lot harder to offshore your credits against account Siphon. Just in general, I think that this has a lot of impact when Glacier decks and decks that are rezzing lots of upgrades and assets are really popular. And I think we're kind of at a period in the game where there's an unprecedented number of that type of deck. This also has the added benefit of being a current. So against RP, you're going to get the additional utility of getting rid of their enhanced login protocols with this. There's probably some other currents that we might see, but in general, I think that the current utility is kind of nice against RP, since this card is already really strong against that deck. I think this card is really powerful and really good. It's very narrow. You're probably only going to be able to play it in the types of decks I was talking about. Probably going to be Anarch. All around, I think that this card is going to be playable for regionals, is going to be really good in a metagame that has lots of Glacier and slow corp decks. I think this is a really solid current. I would probably pick this as the best current on the runner side of the game. The next card that we have is an Anarch resource. It's called Off-Campus Apartment. It's 0 to play and it has 1 influence. It's a location resource. Off-Campus Apartment can host any number of connections. Whenever you install a connection on it, draw a card. I think this card has a lot of potential in the long term. I think it's going to make a lot of sense in the long term. I'm not convinced that this card is all the way there now. It seems really good to me that you'd be able to play like a really resource-heavy deck that would be able to consistently install a bunch of connections on this thing. That seems good. I just don't know, especially within Anarch, if we have enough stuff to do that. Within Anarch, we don't really have that many good connections. I mean, I think that probably Paige Piper is the best one outside of like the neutral ones like Katie Jones or whatever. So I don't know. I'm not sure that we have enough connections, especially within Anarch, to do this. Maybe we could see it in like Shaper. Maybe we could see it in Criminal. Criminal definitely has enough connections. Whether or not they're going to want to build a funky engine to try to draw lots of cards with this, I don't know. I can maybe see this having some usability in Shaper. Seems like it has some pretty good synergy with like Aesop's Pawn Shop, which is itself a connection. I don't know, this seems good. I just don't think that it's all the way there yet. The next card is Career Fair. This is a criminal event. It's 0 to play, and it's 1 influence. Install a resource from your grip, lowering the install cost by 3. So this is basically modded for only resources, but it's also only just an influence versus 2 influence on modded. I think that this has some playability. It does seem really solid with something like, Earthrise Hotel, or just a lot of other very popular resources, maybe Procon, that are pretty expensive to install and give you some sort of long-term advantage. Now, I don't know, unless you're playing a lot of resources, especially those expensive ones, if it would be worth it to do this. And I think that it's already pretty hard to play something like Supplier, which I think potentially saves you a lot more credits in the long term. So I'm not 100% convinced that this is the type of thing that we're going to all start playing, especially if we're just wanting to reduce like our Earthrise cost or whatever. But I do like that this is in the game as an option, and I think that it could work pretty well with a very resource-heavy deck, maybe even based on the previous card that we just looked at. Just in general, a deck that plays a lot of resources that are very expensive, and it can actually get a decent value out of this. I think it's very similar to modded in that respect, where generally modded sucks, but if you're playing a lot of programs or hardware, like an exceptionally large amount of those things, it could be worth it to play modded. I think this is going to serve a similar role, but I think it being 1 influence is a good design choice. I think modded probably should have just been 1 influence because it kind of just sucks. But in general, I think this is a pretty good card. I think it could be played. It's not the best card. Next up, we have another criminal card. This is hardware, and it's called Dorm Computer. It's 0 to play, and it's also 1 influence. Place 4 power counters on Dorm Computer when you install it, and then it has click, remove a hosted power counter, make a run, avoid all tags for the remainder of the run. Ugh, this card kinda sucks. Now, I do think that it has maybe some limited use. It seems pretty good against something like Data Raven, where we want to avoid taking tags from ice. I guess if bandwidth starts being a hot piece of ice in the metagame, this could be decent, I guess. I don't know, this seems like it's going to be highly contingent on a metagame in which you're being given tags mid-run. Right now, there aren't that many ways to do that without ice. I guess maybe Bernice Mai comes up. There's a handful of other ways to give you tags, like during a run. It just seems so limited to use this thing now. I think in the future, if there are more cards that this has an impact against, or if the cards I mentioned, like Data Raven, become exceedingly popular as like the main deck that everybody's playing, this could be the type of thing that you would play like 1 or 2 of. But for now, I'm not convinced that this is really going to be worth including for any particular reason. Maybe in the future, if we see a deck that plays lots of cards that are trashed if you're tagged, we've already seen a few resources like that, this could maybe be a useful card. It would allow you to make some safer runs without having to worry about losing those cards from mid-run tag. I don't know, this is really going to be contingent on your opponent having effects that give you tags during the run. And I think most of the tag effects that we're scared most of don't occur during a run. The next card that we have is a new ID for Shaper. This is Haley Kaplan. She's a Universal Scholar. She's got 0 link and she's 4515 like normal. She's a Gmod. The first time you install a card each turn, you may install another card of the same type from your grip. Well, that ability seems pretty powerful. It's going to essentially save you a click, assuming that you were going to install both of the cards anyway. And if you could use this ability on both turns, on your opponent's turn and your own, you could potentially be getting 2 clicks out of this card a turn. That seems pretty decent to me. It seems like it's really hard to get that kind of click advantage out of any other idea in the game. But at the same time, there's some obvious limitations with this thing. You're going to have to be able to, first of all, have 2 cards of that type. So I think with programs, for example, unless you're playing just an absolutely ridiculous number of programs, it's going to be pretty hard to always have 2 of them on more than like 2 or 3 turns of the game. And I think the same is probably true with hardware, unless again you're playing a huge amount of it. It's worth mentioning that this could work with Replicator, because that would give you additional copies of cards to install. I'm not sure what exactly you're going to replicate, but I thought I would mention that. It's also worth mentioning that this could work with resources and potentially be pretty good with the off-campus apartment that we just looked at. I also think that it could be really good in a genetics setup, because you're going to have to spend so many clicks setting up all of the genetics resources that this could potentially save you a little time doing that. I don't know, I think that this has some potential. I've been sort of toying around with some ideas with it. I've seen a lot of people trying to do cash-oriented stuff, where they play cash, and then they use Aesop's pawn shop to pawn it. I don't know, this seems like it could work, but it's going to require a heavy amount of deck building to get a good value out of, and I'm not sure that what you're going to end up with is going to be any more powerful than the other Shaper decks that we already have. So I'm anxious to see what people do with this. I feel like this could have a very combo-y sort of like Magic the Gathering combo elves sort of feel, where you just play your deck and you're drawing lots of cards and you just go play a card, draw a card, play a card, draw a card for a huge amount of the game. I don't know how easy that strategy is going to be to build, because I'm not exactly sure what you're going to accumulate, what you're going to end up with at the end that's going to be worth it. I don't know, interesting card. I think this is a nice new ID that's different from the other ones. Seems like it has some potential. The next card that we have is also Shaper. This is Game Day. It's an event double, 1 to play, and it's 3 influence. Because it's a double, it takes an additional click to play. If you have fewer cards in your grip than your maximum hand size, draw cards until you have cards in your grip equal to your maximum hand size. Well, I don't think Shaper exactly needs more good events for drawing cards. We already have Diesel and Quality Time. These are both really solid. This does maybe have some interesting uses, though. The first one that I think is pretty obvious is that if your maximum hand size is really high for whatever reason, you know, if you play lots of cards that increase your maximum hand size, this is potentially going to draw a ton of cards. I think most of the time we're really going to be only drawing like 3 or 4 cards with this, though, and I don't think that's worth it as a double. So basically, as a prerequisite for this to be worth it, I think you're going to have something like what I was talking about with the increasing the maximum hand size for this to even be a card you would consider over like Diesel or Quality Time. I will mention, and I'm almost embarrassed to say it, that this maybe could be the start of a deck with Starlight Crusade funding. That card is notoriously terrible. But I think with Power Nap and this, we're starting to see maybe something there with Starlight Crusade funding. I've really always wanted that card to be playable, and it's just been so notoriously awful. And I think as we're starting to see more doubles released, it's starting to maybe be a little more playable. I think if you're going to try to do something with that card, this is the type of thing that you would want in that deck. I don't know, this card is interesting. It's nice to have as an alternative, but I feel like it mainly addresses something that Shaper can already do well. So if you don't have a reason to use it for a specialized purpose, like if your hand size is huge or the Starlight thing I was just talking about, then I think it's probably just going to sit in the box. Next up, we have a new console for Shaper. This is Comet. It's 4 to play, it's 2 influence. It's a console hardware, unique as they are, +1 MU. The first time you play an event each turn, you may play another event without spending a click after the first one resolves, and it's limit 1 console per player. This card seems like it could see some play. I really like the idea that there's just some new consoles for Shaper. I think Shaper's kind of had the short end of the stick when it came to consoles. They've generally been either really expensive or really specialized, or just like kind of mediocre like Astrolabe. I think this one is really powerful and has a very impactful effect, but it's definitely going to be clumsy to use. You're going to have a lot of events in your deck. I think it might be worth looking at Prepaid Kate with this. I'm not exactly sure that the 4 credit tempo loss for installing this thing is going to be worth it, but I think it could potentially see some play in that deck because you already play a lot of events. I've seen a lot of people online talking about how this works well with Haley, and I guess I just don't understand why they think that. I mean, I get it, Haley's Comet, but like, this affects events. Haley affects cards you have to install. Those seem at odds with each other. If you want to get the most value out of Comet, you're going to want to play a ton of events. If you want to get the most value out of Haley, you're not going to want to play a ton of events. I mean, I see that if you were able to save clicks with both this and Haley, that could potentially lead to some very long turns, right? Like you'd have a set of extra clicks, sort of. But I just don't see all of the setup involved and the deck building involved being worth it in any way. This seems like a good console. I don't necessarily think it's going to be a good console for Haley, though. I'll probably be trying this in Prepaid Kate. I anticipate that I might go back to Astrolabe just because the 4 install cost is too high. But I do think that this is could really be worth it if you have enough events in your deck to get a value out of it. Next up, we have a Shaper program. This is called Study Guide. It's 3 to play, it's 1 MU, and it's 4 influence. It starts with 0 strength. It's an icebreaker decoder. Study Guide has +1 strength for each power counter on it. Then it has credit, break a code gate subroutine. Then it has 2 credits, place a power counter on it. Well, like I said with Game Day, this seems like it addresses something that Shaper is already very good at. If we want to break code gates, we have Zool, we have Gordian Blade, and we have Torch, and that isn't even including some of the more specialized things that we have like Cyber Cipher. So we have really, really solid ways to deal with code gates already. Now, one thing that this has as an advantage over all of those is that this is infinitely more flexible. Torch is really, really solid if you're playing against a deck that has lots of high strength code gates, because you're going to want to be able to save the credits on the continued runs against those high strength code gates. It's going to justify the 9 cost of Torch. Conversely, Zool is really awesome if you're only playing against code gates with very low strength, because even if you have to pump up the strength a whole ton of times against, that one really big, their toll booth or their one really big code gate, you're not going to have to do that a ton of times as long as their deck is focused on smaller code gates. Now, the problem is you don't get to make that choice in the game, right? Like, you have to choose one of those to put into your deck. You're probably not going to want to include both of those in your deck. This is maybe a compromise where it's going to not require as much of an investment against the decks that are playing exclusively low strength code gates, and it is going to have that retained strength against the really high strength code gates. So I don't know, it's an expensive way to do that, but I think that flexibility could easily be worth it, especially if you're just looking for, a really awesome code gate solution and you don't really care what it costs. I think in some ways this could be better than Torch at that. So I don't know, I think I'm going to be messing around with this a bit in Stim Shop with Chaos Theory, just because Stim Hack plus this seems pretty good. Gives you another outlet for the Stim Hack. You can pump this thing sky high. I'm really hoping that we're going to see more power counter stuff. We already saw the dorm computer earlier. That was kind of a stinker. But now this has power counters as well. I'd like to see some more power counter stuff. Next up, we have a Shaper resource. This is London Library. It's 3 to install. It's 2 influence. It's a location, and it's unique. Trash all programs hosted on London Library when your turn ends. It has click install a non-virus program from your grip on it, ignoring the install cost. And then it has click add a program on London Library to your grip. Well, even if this doesn't end up being good, this is absolutely Shaper, and I think that this is a really tricky and really interesting, cool option. So what are we going to use this thing for? Right? You're going to install a program. That program's in play. We're going to be able to do cool stuff with that, but we're going to lose the program at the end of the turn unless we spend another click. Well, Scavenge seems like a pretty good option. Gives us a way to put a giant program on this, then scavenge it, and now we've permanently got the thing in play. This also seems like it could potentially be good with something that has counters on it. Right? So like a dog, like a lady, or maybe a David or something like that. That seems like a pretty good use of this as well. It seems like you're going to have a really specific use, like I was just describing, to justify this thing's 3 cost and awkward setup. But this does seem like a pretty usable and powerful card. It seems especially good with the cheating into play of giant icebreakers, or the reuse of counter icebreakers. So, I don't know, I like this card. I'm not immediately super excited to try it in a bunch of pre-existing decks, but I do think that you could make this card work in a Shaper deck. Next up, we have another Shaper resource. This is Tyson Observatory. It's 2 to play, and it's 2 influence. It's a location, and it's also unique. Double click. Search your stack for a piece of hardware, reveal it, and add it to your grip. Shuffle your stack. Well, even if this card doesn't end up seeing play, I really like that it exists in the game. I really like the idea of having more hardware tutors for Shaper, especially since we have a bunch of really weird and like awkward hardware that's good, but it's just really difficult to like get set up and get going. I'm particularly thinking of LLDS Processor, which could potentially work well with the card that we were just looking at, as well as this card. I mean, that seems like it's going to be a lot of bad cards in your deck to get the thing to do its thing, but it could potentially be a decent plan if you could actually build a deck that could get all that stuff going. It is worth mentioning that in a more standard deck, you're going to see a lot of good hardware. We're going to see things like Clone Chip, your console, maybe Plasticrete Carapace. Most decks play good hardware anyway, being able to go fetch a clone chip or an R&D interface or something like that is useful. I just don't know if it's good enough to include this card when you could just play like Quality Time or something like that to just draw cards. So, I don't know. This card is cool. I like this card. I think that this card has a lot of long-term potential as we see more specialized hardware. But I think for now, it's probably not going to see a lot of play. The last card in the pack is neutral, and this is Beach Party. It's a resource, it's no influence, and it's 0 to install. When your turn begins, you lose a click, and your maximum hand size is increased by 5. +5 hand size seems really good, but that loss of a click is going to be absolutely brutal. So basically this card seems like it's going to be contingent on how you're able to mitigate that. Now we did see in the last pack the adjusted chronotype. This could potentially be a way to deal with the loss of a click. Also, we could just pawn this thing to Aesop's pawn shop. I feel like that's going to be a reasonable way to deal with this as well. You're going to get the hand size out of it, and then when you're done with it, you just throw it away. This does have really good synergy with the game day we were looking at earlier, so maybe that Starlight Crusade funding thing I was cooking up could play this thing and could make that effect out of that. I don't know, I like this card. I like the huge increase of hand size. I think that the when your turn begins, lose a click is a sufficient penalty for that. This is definitely a card that could see some play in some very specialized situations, and I think you're really going to have a good idea of what you're going to do to avoid losing that click to justify it. I like this card. I think it's okay. I'm not really anxious to play with it, but I think that there could be some weird decks cooked up with it that could be a lot of fun to play. That's going to do it for part 1 of Breaker Bay. I think we got a lot of interesting, new, cool cards in this pack, especially for Shaper. And I'm really anxious to see what we're going to get done with some of these things. I'm also really excited about part 2, which is going to be about the Corp cards. I think maybe they're even a little bit better. So make sure that you tune in over there, and I'll see you then. And if you like this video, please click subscribe and the button that looks like a thumbs up.